That was perfect timing right there. I just got back from getting a drink of water. Thought I could do all of that in a minute, but I think I just got to it within a minute. So, how are all of you doing? I know it's been a week. It's been a pretty busy week for me, finishing up my last semester here at the University of Michigan. Yesterday we had Steve Dace on the show. Just released that episode a few minutes ago talking about Michigan and his outlook for them. There's a pretty good episode. You should check that out. It just released, and we're going to have more guest appearances over the next several weeks. That's something I want to do regularly. So, yeah, another bit of a break there. Just want to see how you guys are doing before we get started. Today is pretty much all going to be about grading transfer portal classes for top college football teams. So teams that either I'm interested in or teams that I think are at the top or some top programs. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, along with a few minutes dedicated towards Trinidad Chambliss winning his eligibility extension case. I guess that's what you could call it. So he'll be back at Ole Miss for 2026. In my very early research, it's been on a bit of a pause because of the busyness of this past week, but a lot of content next week is going to be centered around me finishing up my winter research, which will probably be, if I'm being honest, most of the research I do this year. We don't have a spring transfer portal segment, so a lot of my views on different teams' rosters will be done by the end of this weekend. Then in the following weeks, I'll do a little bit more digging with coaching and maybe tweak my views on different college football rosters depending on the staffs that I observe. But I did not view Ole Miss as really a top 25 team with all the coaching staff changes and the roster changes and some of the outgoing transfers. And that was with me thinking that Chambliss would get an additional year of eligibility. Given the state of college football, I was pretty convinced of the fact that he would return. I mean, we've seen Diego Pavia's eligibility get extended. We've seen Joey Aguilar's get extended. I bet you he will win his case. We've seen Mohamed Toure get approved for an 8th year of eligibility. It didn't shock me at all that he won his case. That did not shock me one bit. Did not shock me at all. So that is really what we're going to be talking about in addition to the portal. I have a lot of interesting thoughts about the different portal classes. Let me think of how do I want to set this up with how do I want to set this up? I will be grading the portal classes on a variety of criteria. Plenty of them are subjective because I think in football you have to have some margin of error and subjectivity. We're not in the locker rooms. We don't know how these coaches improve or regress year to year. Same with the players. But I tried to look at a variety of factors, and most importantly, I think are 3. That being who you lost in general, so both to the portal, but also to graduation and to the pros. Who are you bringing in to replace them? And who were you able to retain that either started last year or was in the 2 deep and looked to be a valuable part of the team? I know I have 4 fingers up, but again, I said 3 key points. Those are the 3 ones: retention, addition, and subtraction. And all of that really being weighed to last year's team. So if your roster either was amazing last year and you maintained that amazingness, or in some cases even upgraded it, you are going to get some type of an A grade. If you lost a large amount of top-end players, and what you got in the portal and what you have left on your roster and what you brought in is not necessarily going to replace that caliber of athlete, at least in my opinion, but you still have a good roster, you're probably going to get a B. And then if you're a C, you are definitely either on the lower end of college football Power 4 rosters in general, or you've lost a lot of blood, a lot of your talent left either for the pros and or probably in this case and the portal. I think Penn State's a classic case of this. And you did bring in some good players, but ultimately the talent level is dropping off. It's going to take a lot of things for that, talent level to not result in a worse quality of team. Some interesting questions that I just want to address right before we talk about these portal additions. Thank you to Baldfather Betts and Will for being willing to ask these questions here. First one is from Will. Will is asking whether or not I saw the video of Michigan players smoking weed in the locker room. I did see that this morning. My response to that is just kind of whatever. Like, do I approve of it? No, because I think that smoking a lot of weed, well, it's not just I think, it's I know now that several studies have been released on it. It kind of makes you dumb if you do it in the long run and can cause a variety of mental illness. But it is legal in Michigan, and I mean, it's probably better than whatever Georgia has had going on for years with, players crashing their cars or whatnot. It's not as good as some other locker rooms, not as clean as other locker rooms, but look, this is real life. This is college football. There are people, in office jobs that do cocaine and other substances, and I'll just leave it at that in case there's some weird monetization rule on YouTube. Don't think much of it. I mean, the person who discussed that and released it on Twitter and tried to use it as like a gotcha culture moment for Michigan, the owner of that company killed someone because he was 10 bourbons deep and was a miserable person, drunk driving. So I don't take much from it. Baldfather Betts asks, would you put Chambliss in the lead for the Heisman? No, and I would not, because unless he turns into Cam Newton, which he had some moments like that last year, but only some. It wasn't a consistent game per game thing where every game he just looked like this amazing quarterback. I think Ole Miss's roster is regressing, and Chambliss is a great and very impressive college quarterback, but he also, look, if he were Cam Newton, Ole Miss probably beats Miami, and maybe they would have beaten Georgia the first time around. He's a great player, but I don't think that he's top end enough to carry Ole Miss through what is going to be, in my opinion, a pretty rough transition period. I would put him towards the top of the board because he has the capability to carry a team, but he will need to do that in every game with the roster situation Ole Miss has and all those different coaching changes and a tougher schedule. Unfortunately, the Heisman Trophy a lot of the time is about win-loss, power ratings. It's really, as Fernando Mendoza actually put it, it is kind of a team award now. That you don't award the best player, you award one of the best players on one of the best teams. 2021, where Kenneth Walker got snubbed from winning the Heisman, is a classic example of this. Experts knew that Michigan State team really was not that good. They were good, but they were not that good. And that played into them not even inviting him to New York. Travis Hunter in Colorado is a different conversation. There's just media buzz and heavy media bias in favor of Colorado. So that's why Hunter was an exception to the rule, on top of him playing both offense and defense pretty often and generating highlight reels. But most of the time, Heisman winners are from great or elite teams relative to that year. Often there's brand bias involved. and they're one of the better players on a national title caliber team or in that next tier down. So no, because I don't think Ole Miss is going to be that team next year. And while Chambliss is a fantastic player, he is not Arch Manning, Dante Moore. Like he's a great quarterback and maybe the best playmaker at quarterback, but supporting cast and other factors just prevent me from putting him in the lead for the Heisman Trophy. Let's get to the transfer portal, though, and how I'm going to do this is discussing in order of AP poll finish, and then for those that finished unranked, we'll just randomize it, I guess, the different transfer portal classes, the different top-end ones, or ones that I was interested in, and from there, well, we're just going to, grade them, talk about some of the key players, and discuss my thoughts on them. That's what we're going to do. Okay, hold on. There is an issue that I have here. There. That issue's been cleared up. Okay, let's just get down to business. And first and foremost, we'd be talking about the number 1 team in America in 2025, going in order from number 1 to number 25 in the AP poll. We won't be covering all the teams that finished ranked in the AP poll. It would be quite a headache, I think, to cover G5 transfer portal classes and grading those. But we'll be discussing Indiana first. And Indiana is a fascinating case, as they were the first national champion ever to have a majority transfer portal roster and also to break the blue chip ratio. So also grading them, I think, can be a little bit tough, because on one hand, it would be hard for them to replicate the type of team they had last year, very challenging. On another hand, you could argue they're actually upgrading their talent composite, and their overall quality of athlete is upgrading. You can argue those things, and I am in favor of some of those arguments. I give Indiana's 2026 transfer portal class an A+ grade. I do not believe that Josh Hoover is going to be Fernando Mendoza, but if there is one staff that could turn Hoover into a top 5 quarterback, a Heisman winning quarterback, it would be Curt Cignetti, Mike Shanahan, and this wonderful staff that now has Tino Sinceri returning as the quarterback's coach, who coached Curtis Rourke in 2024. Hoover leads the nation in career touchdown passes, and on top of Josh Hoover, who is obviously the storyline addition to this class, as he is going to be Indiana's starting quarterback, you have a lot of other players in the mix here that I thought were key additions. So I think that my favorite addition, outside of Hoover and some players we'll be discussing throughout, would be Joe Hegeli, the 6'3", 300-pound defensive tackle who transferred in from Tulsa. 79.3 PFF grade, has the appropriate size and length, and has good film that should fit in with what Indiana wants to do with the defensive tackle position, which is primarily causing disruption and using speed and athleticism to quickly penetrate through the offensive line and get negative plays. Indiana is a fast defense. They're a disciplined defense. They don't miss tackles. They use speed, quick strikes, pursuit, and not looking at eye candy, not getting distracted by that, and keeping their eye on the football to annihilate offenses. And I think that the former Tulsa defensive tackle fits into that category. Chidi Obiizor from Kansas State is another ad that I really love. I mean, 6'6" at edge is, believe it or not, for a national champion, it's pretty usual. It's not usual for Indiana. Indiana does not have that type of height or, width, strength, girth, whatever you want to call it. They have not had that build usually, and now they have access to that. It's going to be interesting seeing this roster transform and whether or not the magic and the eliteness that Cignetti and the staff were able to work in the past 2 seasons, if it can continue. I'm inclined to think it will, because both rosters year to year had differences, And Zignetti's done this at James Madison, at E-Line, at IUP. I think they're really going to benefit from a different type of athlete. And that's also the case with Joshua Burnham from Notre Dame, 6'3", 217 pounds. He's also taller and 6'3", 217 pounds. That might not be listed correctly there, but Burnham, coming from Notre Dame, had a 74.3 PFF grade. Burnham is he's a serviceable defensive end. At Notre Dame, he got hurt, unfortunately, and much like Pat Coogan, though Pat Coogan didn't get hurt, he wanted to ensure that he was going to be starting at his position. He'll be starting at Indiana, was going to have to rotate at Notre Dame. We'll see if he can follow Coogan's trajectory, though, where Coogan ended up being the best center if you looked at Notre Dame's center and Indiana's center. Preston Zachman's another key addition, 79.6 PFF grade in very limited action as he got hurt after Game 3. He had an amazing 2024 campaign, though, and looked to be one of the Big Ten's top safeties this year before getting injured. This is just much like Joe Brunner, who also transferred in from Wisconsin. You're looking for a better situation. He's an older player, a wiser player. I know that Indiana's safety room will benefit from him pairing up with Amari Farrell. Zooming in on Josh Hoover here for a minute. 29 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, had a 73.6 QBR last year and a 76.8 PFF grade. Hoover had to run an offense at TCU that last year could not run the football. TCU in 2025, if my memory serves me correctly, I believe only averaged 4-something yards per carry in Big 12 play, and it was below 4.5. Oh, that was actually being generous. It was 3.9 yards per carry. Some live research right there. But I knew it was under 5, thought it was under 4.5. They could not run the football. He will have a better offensive line, better running back group. TCU's wide receivers are pretty good, but he'll have better trench play, a better defense, better coaching. His entire supporting cast will be better. We've seen Curtis Rourke take a step forward at Indiana. We've seen Fernando Mendoza do the same thing. I would expect Hoover to take a big step forward in 2026. Joe Brunner, offensive lineman from Wisconsin, did not allow a sack last year, only allowed 9 pressures. That was with an offensive line that was one of the worst in America. I would argue the worst in the Big Ten. They could not run the football. They could not protect the quarterback, as we saw multiple quarterback injuries throughout the season, and they were poorly coached. Wisconsin fired their O-line coach. It was the first year with Jeff Grimes, the offensive coordinator. Rough situation there, and one of the roughest situations in the Big Ten from a program standpoint, and now he's coming to one of the best situations in the conference and in the nation. Toby Osunsanmi is a player that I love because of where he was recruited out of high school, how he's performed at a high level at Kansas State. Got a little bit dinged up last year, but had 14 pressures, 4 sacks, 20 total tackles, and a 67.7 PFF grade. It's another situation where you're getting players that have quality production and reps, age, and development, and they're coming from situations that are just not as prestigious and not as secure, safe, and elite as the situation currently established in Indiana under Cignetti. On top of Burnham and Obi Izor, I expect Indiana to actually improve at defensive end compared to where they were last year, especially at the end of the season where they just were not healthy there. It'll be hard to replace someone like Stephen Daly, but if anyone's going to do that, it's going to be Osunsanmi out of the edge group. And last but not least, we have A.J. Harris. A.J. Harris is a curious case of someone who was projected to be a first-rounder after 2024, and then as Penn State imploded, so did he. He did not have a lot of good tape last year. If we were solely judging him off of last year, this would be a questionable addition. We've seen him play well before at Penn State. He was recruited to Georgia last year. I don't know whether that was a he thing, an A.J. Harris thing, and he was just playing badly, or if that was more of a Penn State thing, where Penn State never seemed right the minute they took the field, and after that Oregon loss, the entire the helium was out of the balloon. It was like you take a balloon and you just popped it with like an X-Acto knife or something. Like something really, you took a katana to a balloon. and Penn State completely fell apart. I would expect him to rebound. Personally, I am giving a lot of benefit of the doubt to Indiana here, obviously, but I don't think any staff deserves more benefit of the doubt than they do when assessing talent based on the 2024 and 2025 seasons. Gotta stop forgetting that. I don't think there is any other staff you can give more benefit of the doubt to than Curt Cignetti, Mike Shanahan, Bryant Haynes, and this Indiana staff right now. That's why I'm giving this class an A+ grade, on top of the fact that, look, they did lose a good chunk of players to the NFL. They did not lose any starters yet again to the portal. They retained key starters, and they brought in a very talented collection of young men to lead Indiana towards the top of the sport yet again in 2026. Next up, we have Miami. I'm giving the Miami Hurricanes an A grade for their 2026 transfer portal class. What I loved about Miami, much like Indiana, is you do lose a lot to the NFL, but you bring in talented players, X-factor players, some alien players in Darian Mensah, I think, obviously, and you didn't lose a whole lot to the portal either. Miami is a staff, too, that has pretty much nailed the vast majority of their transfer portal additions and classes in the past. We have seen some top-end programs, Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, who've been a bit more bipolar in that field. Ohio State nailing their 2024 class and completely whiffing on last year's class. Georgia whiffing on the portal for the most part, outside of maybe last year's receiver class. And at Alabama, it's been whiff after whiff after whiff pretty much every time. For Miami, Jarquez Carter is a defensive tackle from Ohio State that barely played as a true freshman. That's probably a developmental and depth addition for Miami. I would argue that's at least, good after losing how much they did. Ruben Bain, Akeem Mesidor, David Blay. Your more important addition to that group is Keona Davis, a defensive lineman at Nebraska who's pretty light in the pants for a defensive tackle, but he's coming over, again, from a very rough situation, much like we've seen from a lot of Indiana transfers who were good players in rough situations. They're going to be in a much better situation, have better development. I was very impressed with how Jason Taylor and that defensive staff, especially with the defensive line, managed this group this year. They returned a lot from last year, so you expected improvement, but they also nailed their portal additions. They developed depth and improved their starters, and both of those areas were questions after what happened in 2024 with the defense. I would expect Davis to be an immediate contributor. Omar Thornton is a key addition at safety from Boston College. And then you got two receivers in Cam Vaughn and Vendravius Jacobs, who each had around, 500 receiving yards. Again, very rough situations. West Virginia's in a full-on rebuild with Rich Rodriguez. And Shane Beamer is doing his best impersonation of a circus clown with no formal training as the head coach at South Carolina. I mean, they literally had Lenora Sellers and Dylan Stewart. Can you do with your body what 11 men can do with their bodies? They were asked to be the entire offense and defense respectively. With Miami, you actually have a brotherhood. You have a real coach. You have a real staff. You're going to have real success. So I love most of these additions. Mensah is the key addition here. Top 20 QBR with no defense at Duke. They sustained multiple injuries. It's hard to be an effective CEO and play caller as a head coach, and Diaz is trying to do both. Mensah had 34 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, and 3,973 passing yards, 66.8 completion percentage, and an 84.1 PFF grade. Darian Mensah is a quarterback who, in the right system, is going to be excellent. He was a top-end quarterback at Tulane, top-end at Duke. Miami got desperate with their quarterback room and how they kept getting turned down, so they went all in. One of the bigger, larger NIL deals in history to get Mensah. I applaud them for doing that. I wish that things operated differently, but they don't. So since they don't operate differently, I'm going to applaud Miami for making the move. Mensah will be a top 5 quarterback for Miami. Cooper Barcotti, or maybe I said his name wrong, he is Mensah's one of his key friends at Duke and was his top receiver. Had over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, had a phenomenal game at Clemson where he was able to exploit some coverage busts. 6'1", 189 pounds, will do well under Miami's coaching staff and already has established chemistry with Miami's next quarterback. So that's incredibly helpful. Damon Wilson is a different type of addition to this class. Most of the key additions that we've seen that are going to be immediate contributors are on offense, receiver, and quarterback. They did not make any additions to the O-line, but I trust Alex Mirabal there. For Damon Wilson, you're bringing in a player who went, Georgia, Missouri, now to Miami. I have a funny story, a funny rumor about how reportedly he just wants to get sacks and pressures, and when asked about run defense, he said, that's not my thing. I get sacks. So take from that what you will. Just a rumor, nothing official. If you heard it from me, you probably have heard it from multiple people already because I'm not an insider. I just found that to be pretty funny. But he is electric at getting after the quarterback. Had a lot of success on a good Missouri defense this past season. 54 pressures, 9 sacks. It's going to be hard to reload after losing Akeem Mesidor and Reuben Bain Jr., but maybe with the type of athlete Miami has and pairing Damon Wilson II with Marquise Lightfoot, maybe one of the top transfer portal classes for 2026 can reload even after losing 2 bona fide first or at worst second round edge players. For our next team, for Oregon, again, going in order of finish in the polls, I give Oregon's transfer portal class a B+. Oregon had probably one of the smaller and more selective portal classes under Dan Lanning that it's had in his tenure. Their 2026 class was ranked in the top 30 per On3, but not much higher than that. They have had some very underrated key additions, and they also have one major addition, well, technically 2, in Dylan Raiola and Coy Parrish. For Raiola, he is more of a 2027 addition and some depth for 2026, so we're not going to talk about him a ton. I will say for Raiola that this is a very good addition for Oregon. And it's a very good addition, not elite, but could develop into being an elite addition. Certainly not bad, because when you play behind an offensive line that is a sieve, that is a papier-mâché bomb shelter, that is a wall made up of sand, you're not going to have success. I mean, Minnesota broke their single game sack record post 2023 clock rules. So they basically broke their single game sack record in 3 quarters. If you're looking at pre-2023 clock rules, 3 quarters, because Nebraska's offensive line was that terrible. It was awful. It was hard to watch. I think behind an Oregon offensive line that consistently is one of the best year over year, because Alik Terry is so good at his job, unlike the now fired Donovan Raiola, I think he'll have better success. And he will sit behind Dante Moore, learn the system, learn the playbook. He'll also have better receivers, running backs, tight ends, etc., a better defense to give him some security than what Raiola had at Nebraska. Iverson Hooks is probably my favorite addition of this portal class for Oregon. In hindsight, I probably should have made a graphic for him and put Coy Parrish on just the normal, best 5 players that I like graphic, because Iverson Hooks is that Tez Johnson, little light in the pants, 5'10", 160 receiver who makes up for being a little bit light by being twitchy, finding ways to be open, never quits. He had an 82.3 PFF grade. Michael Bennett was one of the top offensive tackles in this cycle. That was a great addition. Oregon, their offensive line reminded me of a line that really is 5 guards, and you don't really have a true tackle there. And that got exposed by Texas Tech and a little bit by Indiana twice as well. Aaron Scott Jr. and Deontay Robinson are more depth pieces. Oregon needed that with how much they lost to the transfer portal. I think both are great additions if you're looking at depth. For Coy Parrish, their best addition per recruiting rankings and per portal rankings, I would probably classify him as one of their top additions, but not as good as Raiola or Iverson Hooks, just based on the fact he had a down year at Minnesota. I don't exactly know where he's at, but I would trust Oregon and new defensive coordinator Chris Hampton to work him in well, to develop him. Parrish, when he is only playing as a safety and they're not trying to make him into Timu Travis Hunter, I have no idea why Fleck thought that was a good idea. You get a safety that is a potential first rounder, if not second rounder. You get someone who is at least Dylan Thieneman caliber, and someone who I am pretty confident Ohio State wanted multiple times to pair with Caleb Downs or pair with their safety room. And if, whether it's Jim Knowles or whether it's Matt Patricia, if they wanted him, it's the same thing with Terry Moore, who Ohio State actually got out of the portal, then you want him as well. Parrish is a bit raw, but I also don't know if he was developed all that well at Minnesota. Oregon is much better coaching than Minnesota, on top of having a better supporting cast and more talent. So I think that addition is likely going to pan out and is one of my favorite ones. Oregon gets a B+ in the portal class and simply not in the A range because they did lose some depth. They returned a lot of players from the draft, but outside of really Iverson Hooks, Michael Bennett, and maybe Coy Parrish, they didn't have many great impactful additions. A lot of this to me seemed to be depth additions to add on to the best returning roster in college football. Ohio State, in terms of looking at their portal, it's interesting because if you solely look at past recruiting rankings, this is probably one of the best portal classes in the country. I think if you adjust for how those players have played at their different stops, this is probably a good portal class, but certainly not a great one. I'm giving Ohio State a B grade for their 2026 transfer portal class. This factors in how much they lose to the NFL, some of the depth they lost, and the fact that while they did do an adequate job replacing some key departures, both in terms of depth and in terms of NFL talent, they also lacked in replacement for some of those players. Looking at their key additions for 2026, I think that James Smith, Qua Russa, Christian Allegro, and Earl Little Jr., and a lot of those players are, 3 of the 4 were formerly recruited to Alabama by Nick Saban. They never panned out there, so Earl Little Jr. went to Florida State, where after having a down 2024, he did a much better job in 2025. Russa and Smith were highly recruited out of high school, but at Alabama, they haven't really progressed at all. They were relegated to backup duty by the end of the year, and now they're at Ohio State. Allegro's been starting at Wisconsin for years, a few years now, but with Mason Posa and some other youngsters, rising to the occasion and helping Wisconsin's defense improve as the season goes on, he's not going to start there, so he goes to Ohio State. Ohio State, we heard about this through many of their insiders or people connected to the program. Mike Washman, a friend of the channel who covered Ohio State for years, said publicly on his Twitter that they were short a few million of the budget that they wanted. And I think their portal class kind of reflects that, where you lose Cade McDonald and you bring in James Smith, who's smaller, and through, I think, 2 or 3 years, getting significant reps at Alabama, he's never showed anything like Caden McDonald did. Qua Russa should be a nice guy to pair with Kenyatta Jackson Jr., but is he Arvell Reese? Is he going to be better than Caden Curry? I mean, probably not. We'll have to see. Allegro is a fantastic pass rusher. I would not be shocked if they moved him to edge and he had a really fantastic year there. He's not a great off-ball linebacker, though. He's not good in coverage. He's not that great at tackling. Is he great at blitzing and getting pressure on the quarterback? Yes. I would not be shocked if Patricia used him in certain sets and formations as one of the blitzing linebackers. Or a little junior. I would say good player, but is he better than good? And that's the standard at Ohio State, is to be better than good. It's to be great. It's to be elite. I don't know. I think he's playing nickel, so he'll probably fill in a similar role to Lorenzo Styles and have a similar caliber of play there. Out of all of these 5 that are displayed here, probably like Dominic Kelly the most because he's younger and got playing time at Georgia and was likely going to get a bigger role for Georgia this year. He's 6 foot, so he has the appropriate height to play corner. There are exceptions like D'Angelo Pons, but having height, I think, does help in some instances. And he's young, so you can coach him, you can mold him. He is a bigger addition for the team because he's not going to just be there for a year or 2 years. He could be there for even 3 years if he pans out. So he's one of my favorite additions. Some other great additions to this class were Terry Moore. Terry Moore, I think, is an All-American safety. That was a addition that cemented my belief that Ohio State is going to be in a better position than anyone to reload at safety if said team lost Caleb Downs from their safety room. They're going to have one of the top safety rooms in America again, even after losing maybe the best safety prospect since Ed Reed, or maybe one of the best of all time. He had a 90.1 PFF grade in 2024 with 4 interceptions, 5 passes defended, a sack, and 2 forced fumbles. If he can be healthy, he will be one of the best safeties in the Big Ten, possibly the best safety in the Big Ten. So that was an important addition. Another important addition was kicker Connor Hawkins. Connor Hawkins, when I was grading Ohio State's portal class and looking through it, I thought, okay, downgrade at the position, downgrade at the position, downgrade at the position. I don't like this class a ton. Hawkins made me think that this class is acceptable, at least by Ohio State standards, because Jaden Fielding has cost Ohio State several wins, especially big wins. Last year against Indiana, did not help against Miami either, where if he made that long field goal, Ohio State could have eventually tied Miami. Instead, they were still behind the chains even after an amazing, third quarter, early fourth, and ultimately that, helped them lose the game. Think about Michigan in 2024. That was bad. If he had a big leg and an accurate leg, they could have beaten Oregon that same year. And then in 2023, didn't help the Michigan game, missed in the Missouri game. In 2022 even, when they had Noah Ruggles, if he had a stronger leg with a longer range, you beat Georgia and you beat TCU when you win the national title. So kicking and special teams has cost Ryan Day year over year over year. I don't know if the special teams in general is going to be fixed, but half of special teams pretty much is making your field goals. And I think that Connor Hawkins is one of the best kickers in America. 37 of 37 in extra points, 81.8% with field goals, career long of 54, and he's only been at Baylor for 2 years. So you'll have him for a few years because I imagine they paid him pretty handsomely for a kicker. This Ohio State portal class for me gets a B. They did have a lot of additions that could pan out, but the key word there is could. There are only a few additions in this class that I think are bona fide great players. The others you have to see if they're going to pan out or if they're not going to pan out. And in the 2 seasons that Ohio State's really used the portal heavily, 2024 and 2025, we've seen opposite extremes where the 2024 portal class was an A+. This past season's was probably as close to an F as you could get. I imagine this is going to be somewhere in the middle and be a B or C caliber class based on the players that the Buckeyes have added. Next up, I want to talk about Georgia's portal class. The Georgia Bulldogs receive a B- grade from me. Georgia receives a B- grade for their 2026 transfer portal class. They have had issues in the portal ever since it opened under Kirby Smart, where outside of really last year and the receivers and figuring out that position, I really have not been impressed with their additions. Last year, Elo Mendoza came over from Army. He's already in the portal. He didn't play that much. Josh McCray played some and had a critical fourth down conversion against Ole Miss in the regular season. But outside of that, he didn't do much, and Chauncey Bowen slowly replaced him in the two deep at running back, and Frazier, Nate Frazier, almost said Mekhi Frazier, he was starting for the whole year at running back, and that's not even referencing several of their players at defensive back that they brought in the portal, and they didn't really pan out, and some of those players have left for other pastures. It's a bit strange because when you think of Georgia, you think of a national power, you think of a program that can have it all and have the goods. And that's been the case with Ohio State and Alabama for years too. Was the case for Clemson for years too, until they finally missed on quarterback recruiting and missed on some coaching things, and then the portal snowballed that into now being back to a mediocre program. Georgia and Ohio State are not back to being mediocre. I don't think they will be anytime soon. Alabama is kind of at a fork in the road where they could be mediocre very shortly. But with Georgia and Ohio State as well, we just talked about Ohio State in the previous portal segment, they are not able to get the players that ideally they would want in the portal because their budgets aren't the biggest. Based on how Georgia is able to maintain a lot of its roster, but then in the portal they're getting Amaris Williams, who didn't play that much at Auburn, and while he has a lot of upside isn't everything. Your floor matters too. Or they got Khalil Barnes from Clemson, who, look, he is not that good of a safety. Gentry Williams is an okay player from Oklahoma, but Oklahoma's secondary was also the weakness of their defense and cost them games against Ole Miss and Texas. They got a freshman in Bryson Beaver, and their best addition is probably Isaiah Canyon, a receiver from Georgia Tech who had 500, 600 receiving yards, did well in Buster Faulkner's system, Haynes King's offense. I think that it's pretty obvious here they're lacking in funds and in resources. I would imagine that LSU, Texas A&M, Texas, Auburn, Tennessee, Missouri, Ole Miss. There's a lot of teams based on their portal activity that probably spend more than Georgia is, or at least much more willing to spend for top-end players than Georgia. Part of that's because they don't have the roster talent of Georgia outside of Texas, who does and might have passed them over this 2026 preseason. We'll see how that pans out in 2026 if that intuition of mine is correct. But a lot of your traditional powers, either because they slowly adapted to NIL or they're more resistant to it, or they just don't have the same type of financial backing or alumni backing as they thought, or as other schools who are, towards the top do, they're bleeding talent or hemorrhaging talent. And with Georgia, they had an opportunity to return some offensive linemen. Instead, they declare to go pro. They lose a lot of their receivers, and they really only brought in a receiver addition in Canyon, who's good, but is that enough to replace, the outgoing Noah Thomas, Colby Young? They lose Christian Miller on the defensive line. They return most of their defensive line, so that's good. And they return a lot of their linebacker core except for C.J. Allen, but they are decreasing in talent as the years go on. And that, along with a small portal class, even though they retain some key players, with the NFL departures, with some of the portal departures they had, and with a pretty small class that is questionable in terms of quality, I would have to give them a B- grade here. I think that their roster talent is sliding back, and it is at a noticeable, measurable rate, and that is, not good. They're still towards the top, and I have a lot of respect for Kirby Smart and his staff and a lot of trust in them, which is why I have this in the B range. But it is not an A caliber class, and if I had to make a choice between raising this to a B or lowering it to a C+, I would lower it to a C+. Georgia, with how they've recruited in high school and how they developed, has to continue banking on those things, because in the portal, they've not had a lot of success, and I don't think they have the funds to have a lot of success, just based on intuition, based on, how they've recruited in the portal and the type of players they've gotten. It feels like they don't have a ton of funds or resources. They have to try to continue their high school model and keep players home. I feel like that is going to be their key to success. It really does feel like in the portal, Georgia's just either trying to build depth or fulfill the wide receiver needs at that position, and that's kind of it. Sorry to be a bit bland there, but it does kind of feel like that's where Georgia is at. And yes, for someone in the comment section, I did already grade Indiana. That was the first portal class we graded. Texas Tech, they nailed their portal class again. They receive an A+ grade from me. They did not lose a ton to the portal. Yes, they lost players to the pros, but they've recruited well out of high school. They did a good job developing last year. Their scouting was up there with Indiana's for being top tier, and I think they've scouted well yet again. When you have an Auburn receiver coming to your building, and it was the number 2 wide receiver in a receiver group that included Cam Coleman, you are getting an NFL player. You are getting a guy in the Big 12 who could be a stud there and maybe the number 1 receiver in the Big 12, replacing, the outgoing Jordan Tyson, who was that when healthy last year. Malcolm Simmons is amazing. He had a 71.2 PFF grade. Again, the only reason he wasn't Auburn's wide receiver 1 is because Cam Coleman existed. And Cam Coleman is, in that recruiting class of 2024 where you had Jeremiah Smith, you got Cam Coleman, you had Ryan Williams. It's Jeremiah Smith at 1 and Cam Coleman at 2. It's a pretty phenomenal high school wide receiver class, maybe one of the best in recent memory. And Cam Coleman, is towards the top of that board. Malcolm Simmons is a pretty phenomenal wide receiver and he'll look like an alien if he isn't already in the Big 12. Let's just put it that way. He will do 2 defenses in the Big 12 what David Bailey, Romello Height, A.J. Holmes, and Lee Hunter did to offensive lines in the Big 12. He'll just destroy them. Jordan Church, key addition from Louisville on the offensive line to help bulk up that unit, establish some depth there. Mateen Ibarugba is a defensive tackle from Wake Forest, older player, experienced player. A.J. Holmes is really the only defensive lineman last year that played significant reps who returns. So him, along with Julian LaVenture, defensive tackle transfer from Akron, are really going to have to bolster that group. In addition to Malcolm Simmons, Texas Tech got an FCS stud, Jalen Jones from the Alabama State Hornets, 5'9", 175 pounds, nearly a 90 PFF grade. Fantastic with Alabama State last year. I'm curious to see how you got Coy Eakin, Jalen Jones, Malcolm Simmons, and then you got Terrence Carter Jr., the tight end. With Brennan Sorsby, I'm curious to see if this offense takes a massive step forward with the quarterback upgrade, the upgrade for wide receiver 1, as Simmons would have been their best receiver last year, and the offensive line should also be better. Same with the running backs, as the top 2 running backs from last year's Tech team do return. Sorsby was top 15 in QBR, 27 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He had 2,800 passing yards. And what is fantastic about Sorsby is he had success with the Cincinnati team whose defense was suspect and whose coaching is suspect. Few in the coaching world respect Scott Satterfield. Few in media, few in people who cover the sport, analysts, respect Scott Satterfield. He's kind of a meme, not in a good way. And yet he had a 155.1 passer rating. He also had success at Indiana in 2023 in Tom Allen's final year. Sorsby is a great player, and you know that because he puts up good numbers, he looks good on film, he carries his team and is often the best player on his side of the ball, and he is that with bad coaching staffs. Now he'll be joining a superior coaching staff, a superior roster. The best roster and staff he has ever had is going to be what he's working with in 2026. So That is why I think he is destined for success and will be a huge upgrade compared to Baron Morton. Adam Trick is another player that I want to highlight here. Played at Miami of Ohio with a 91.3 PFF grade, 8.5 sacks and 67 pressures, 6'4", 230 pounds. He's going to have to gain some weight for sure, but Adam Trick is one of the top players in the MAC, 6'4", 242 pounds. My apologies for that incorrect information. He's a little bit, I think kind of, if I'm being honest, like some of these past Texas Tech incoming transfers where they have the requisite production and the film and just this, desire to play hard. I mean, Miami of Ohio started off 0-3 last year. They're well coached under Chuck Martin. And, he kept playing and helped Miami of Ohio to at one point go on a 5-game win streak after starting 0-3. And he is a true edge, listed as a linebacker per ESPN. I really love this addition. I don't know if he'll be David Bailey. I don't know if he'll be Romello Height. I think the odds of him being one of those two are much higher than other people believe. Trey White is a fantastic addition from San Diego State. 51 pressures, 7 sacks there, and 47 total tackles, 30 of them being solo. This team's going to reload on the defensive line. I hope you guys get used to that, where Texas Tech is going to go from a stereotypical air raid team that has no defense to having absolutely suffocating defense that's frustrating to deal with. There's a reason. I think that Oregon's offense had some issues, and Indiana's defense was probably the best in terms of fundamental soundness, and maybe the most consistent overall defense, or the defense with the highest floor. In the same way, I think Ohio State's defense probably had the highest ceiling with the amount of first-rounders they had on it. Texas Tech's defense had the most frustrating defensive front to deal with because they were able to do what Indiana did in terms of tackling and in terms of penetration and pass rush, while also having a much higher athletic profile on the defensive line. And I don't think that's going away, even though it's not going to be replicated at the same level every year. Speaking of defensive front, that includes linebacker, not just defensive tackles or edge players, in case you forgot. Austin Romaine, I projected him to be the top Big 12 linebacker last year. Benjamin Rodriguez and Ben Roberts were probably better, but that also might have been due to supporting cast and coaching. I mean, you saw Chris Kleiman when he announced his retirement. He hated it, but he's a good coach, was successful at North Dakota State, ultimately successful at Kansas State too, winning them the Big 12 title when they had to play, Oklahoma and Texas still, and the conference was a bit stronger. He just got tired. He got tired of it. All the different coaching changes, the new era, and him being more of an, old school coach, and this new era with a lot of different changes and things. There was probably some misses in terms of coaching hires, a little bit of being checked out and tired of all of it. And he retired at the end of the year because he did the right thing and realized he couldn't do this anymore. You're going to enter a roster and staff and program and culture that is perfectly equipped for the new era. And you're going to be possibly the top linebacker in the Big 12 with definitely the top roster in the conference. So I love Romaine to have success there and be Texas Tech's either linebacker 1 or 2, because they do return Ben Roberts, who is pretty fantastic. It's an A-plus portal grade. They nailed it once again. Do not be surprised when Texas Tech is yet again a top 5 team and constantly flirting with being in the top 5 of most major analytical systems and models. Alabama, we're going to be very short, brief, and try to be as sweet as possible with it because it's not pretty. Alabama continues to hemorrhage talent, and this 2026 portal class they just brought in and the players they left shows it. They are bleeding, and the bleeding is not stopping. This is not a good portal class whatsoever, and let me tell you why. Devin Tompkins is someone who USC probably let walk out the door and said, okay, yeah, go collect your check. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. He is a okay defensive tackle who played and started for USC, but Jakeem Stewart, Jade Abasiri, and others that they've recruited in that group are younger, have higher ceilings, and are just going to be better players at USC than Devin Tompkins will. They just will. On top of that, Alabama also loses Tim Keenan. Terrence Green is probably the best defensive tackle addition, depth player at Oregon, bigger than Devin Tompkins, and also a stronger player, better recruited, better developed in a better defensive system last year than Tompkins was. When I look at that group, and I understand that London Simmons played well, I understand that you need depth. However, this roster you can look at edge, you can look at the offensive line where, you lose Caden Proctor, you lose Parker Brailsford, you lose Wilkin Formby. They brought in some transfers, and most of them were players who were either backups and poor ones at that, like Nick Brooks from Texas, or they brought in, lower level offensive linemen to start immediately for the Tide. Noah Rogers is a good addition at wide receiver for them, but is he going to replace Isaiah Horton and Jeremy Bernard leaving, and a phenomenal wide receivers coach in Jamarcus Shepard leaving to be the head coach at Oregon State? I don't think so, guys. I really don't think so. Is Austin Mack or Keelan Russell going to be ready to, fill in Ty Simpson's shoes, especially if they don't figure out the rushing attack? Again, I don't know. I do know that Clem, their new offensive line coach, is a huge upgrade over Chris Kaplovich, who I was never high on with the Alabama Crimson Tide, but that might take some time, especially since your talent level at that position continues to drop off. And that's the case for the entire roster. The entire Alabama roster is a nickel and dime version of what it was under Nick Saban. It's not close. 2023 Alabama, for all of its flaws, all the questionable development and coaching on that roster, the inability of Jalen Milroe to complete an intermediate or short pass and rely on deep shots, and those deep shots meant nothing if you didn't have a talent advantage at wide receiver against the opposing corners. That team would destroy this roster. I mean, it would not be close. It would probably look like a NFL roster from the worst NFL team playing the best college team. It would be over. So it's not a good portal class. That's why I give it a D grade. Maybe I'm being too negative. Maybe Alabama people won't like this, but Kalen DeBoer and this staff are going to have to work magic in 2026 if there isn't going to be a significant drop-off in talent. And in order to compensate for a significant talent drop-off, you have to have significantly better coaching. And while I do think the coaching for Alabama will be better this coming season than last season, especially with the new O-line coach, I don't know if it will offset the talent drop-off. In fact, if I had to choose, I would say no, it's not going to. They're going to have to bank on younger players and their new development to make sure Alabama can contend for the college football playoff. As for Notre Dame had an interesting portal strategy. Curt Cignetti talks about production over potential. Notre Dame's transfer portal class, to me, screamed potential over production. I'm still giving it an A- grade because there are multiple avenues to success. Usually, production over potential, I think, is the right move, as Indiana being the first team ever to win with a non-blue chip ratio roster and one with a mostly transfer portal roster would suggest that staff knows what they're talking about. But I also think Notre Dame knows multiple things about roster construction. It's why Marcus Freeman has an excellent win percentage. It's why he was the first Notre Dame head coach of the 21st century to win a New Year's Six Bowl or the equivalent of that in his, multiple playoff wins, 3 of them in their 2024 college football playoff run. I love what I'm seeing out of their strategy, where they did not lose a ton of players to the draft, were they did, it was O-line and running back. They pretty much returned all the guys they could realistically bring back on defense. It's one of the more loaded defensive rosters, not just of this coming year, but that I've seen in recent memory. As long as the coaching there pans out, and I do believe they're going to receive coaching upgrades, I like the addition of the former Illinois defensive coordinator. Name escapes me. Illinois fans did not like him as a DC, but he did develop Devon Witherspoon and has had several serviceable to even elite Illinois secondaries in his time there. So I think that's a good addition. They also made an addition at the defensive line position with an NFL defensive line coach. So I think those two hires are pretty good. And when you look at these players that they've added, Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham, 5-star receivers from Ohio State, if they develop and they're paired with C.J. Carr, who's one of the top quarterbacks in America, now Notre Dame will have one of the top passing attacks in the country. Tony Gray, fantastic addition at defensive tackle from Oregon, that's for sure. Good length, good height, like perfect prototypical NFL defensive tackle build. He'll be joining Francis Brewu and Jason Anye and plenty of other players who return. And very quickly, this is one of the deeper defensive tackle rooms in all of America. And you also have cornerback Jaden Sanders, who played as a true freshman at Michigan. Notre Dame probably offered him more than Michigan did, and it is something that will probably be mutually beneficial to both Michigan as they upgrade at corner, and also beneficial to Notre Dame, who, like anyone, can use more depth. They already have a deep corner room, but they add him and DJ McKinney to give them some options there and better protect against some injuries. They've been familiar with injuries. I remember Benjamin Morrison for them back in 2024. He got hurt, and Christian Gray and Leonard Moore had to step up, and they did. And that was thanks to the elite coaching and development of Mike Mickens at that position. Looking at, I think their best addition would be Francis Brewu. Brewu was a top defensive tackle from Pittsburgh. Ohio State wanted him. It came down to, I think, Brewu or taking the 2 Alabama transfers. Ohio State got the 2 Alabama transfers. Notre Dame got Brewu. If I had to pick between one or the other, it would depend based on depth. And I think Notre Dame entering this year had a deeper D-line than Ohio State, so probably a win-win. But Brewu would be the best player out of those 3. Brewu was one of the best players on Pittsburgh, their defense, along with Rasheem Biles, who went to Texas and is going to be the top linebacker in the sport this coming year. 20 pressures, a sack, is a force on the interior, will really add a different dynamic to this Notre Dame defense. Another addition they've had, didn't mean to do that. He'll add a dynamic effect to this Notre Dame defensive front, which is among one of the deepest and best at stopping the run in college football. A lot of players who, if they pan out, fantastic. If they don't, our roster's already loaded, so it will hurt, yes, but it's not going to end our season. That's what this Notre Dame portal class reads to me, and why I give it an A- grade. Looking ahead to Texas. Texas, love what they added in the portal, that's for sure, and that is because the Texas Longhorns, they aced it. Texas, I think, probably had the top quality class in terms of incoming players. That's how I would put it. Top quality class in America when you look at the incoming players. When you look at who leaves to the NFL, when you look at who leaves via the portal from Texas, you could argue that maybe overall it's not the top class, but it is one of the best portal classes in America. Texas has made it pretty clear that, they're trying to go for a national title or bust type of year. And yes, fight on natties. This is live. The chat's pretty empty, but there are people watching this. It is live, believe me. Texas has one of the top portal classes entering 2026. I give it an A+ grade. According to On3, it is a top 10 portal class, and that is factoring in some key players leaving. They lost a starting linebacker. They lost DeAndre Moore Jr. at wide receiver, Parker Livingston at wide receiver. They lost a lot of good players, but then gained a lot of elite players, and that's very hard to do in the modern era. So how did Texas do that? Well, they did it through a combination of NIL, of appeal to playing with Arch Manning, their coaching staff, which is working tirelessly on the recruiting trail at all times and is one of the better coaching staffs in America. And I'll just reference NIL for a second time because it's no secret that Texas has some of the deepest pockets in America. They've made that very clear with how they recruit, their strategies. Even their opponents have made that clear, with Kirby Smart and Georgia constantly trying to dig at them or throw shade at them for their strategies in the portal and in recruiting. Melvin Saini, Raleek Brown, Ian Jeffrard, Lawrence Seymour, and Michael Masunis. What do all of these players have in common? They are all veterans with proven production, and something they may not all have in common, but most of them have in common, is they're all future NFL players. Masunis could be a future NFL player. I think he did a good job at Michigan State given the supporting cast. Melvin Saini, Ian Jeffrard, and Raleek Brown are future NFL players, future draft picks with how they have played in college. There is a lot of potential and a lot of production with the vast majority of players that Texas has added to its roster. Brown had an 80.7 PFF grade and over 1,000 rushing yards with Arizona State. Ian Jeffrard was one of the best players in an Arkansas defense that had no coaching whatsoever. I imagine he'll play at a higher level with Texas's coaching and supporting cast. And Melvin Saini was a great offensive tackle at Wake Forest. Texas already returned Brandon Baker and Trevor Gooseby, but they want their options on the offensive line and they want depth there. So they made sure to make that a priority. Cam Coleman was their best addition. 708 receiving yards last year, 5 touchdowns, and only averaged 12.6 yards per reception because Jackson Arnold can't throw a forward pass. That's why Jackson Arnold is going to UNLV, to play under Dan Mullen, for the same reason Alex Orji did, for the same reason that Anthony Calandria did. They are not effective throwers of the football. They're not just effective. They're not just horrible passers. They're bad throwers. There's a difference. And that's an indictment on those type of players. That's Jackson Arnold. Jackson Arnold is a glorified service academy quarterback. He is. Watch the game against Baylor. Watch his games against SEC competition, even mediocre SEC defenses. He's not that good. That's probably part of the reason why all of Auburn's receivers, literally, Perry Johnson, Malcolm Simmons, Cam Coleman, and Eric Singleton Jr. It's like their top 4 receivers. They all left. Part of it was probably due to Golesh having some new strategies, or maybe they didn't like the offense he ran. Probably an even bigger part of it's just the frustrations of that entire Hugh Freeze era and just wanting a new start. Cam Coleman's going to get paid handsomely. He'll be developed handsomely, and he'll be working with one of the best quarterbacks in America. Hollywood Smothers was committed to Alabama but never actually enrolled, and then Texas poached him away. That's a key addition. Now you have, because Smothers was only 61 rushing yards away from 1,000 yards, now you have basically 2 1,000-yard backs who are more talented than Contravian Wisner, more talented than C.J. Baxter, and will have a better offensive line working with them, to where you could go from having one of the worst rushing attacks in America to one of the best rushing attacks in America. 5.9 yards per carry with an ACC team that just does not have the type of supporting cast or coaching that Texas does. Now, he will be facing tougher competition, sure, but it's not like NC State was one of the top rosters in the ACC. They were probably a middle of the pack, maybe, upper tier ACC roster. Texas has the best SEC roster, and I can very confidently say that even though we were several months away from kickoff. Rasheem Biles is my favorite addition to Texas's defense. 83.7 PFF grade, 2 forced fumbles, 2 picks, 4.5 sacks, 100 total tackles. He's linebacker number 1 in this upcoming season. And I'm not going to talk about NFL stuff yet. I still want to make my own content about the NFL draft, this coming NFL draft, so I don't want to look ahead to the 2027 NFL draft, but he will be picked pretty highly, I think, in the 2027 NFL draft too. Older player, but fantastic college player, did well in Randy Bates' system with more talent surrounding him, and again, better coaching, better organization. I do think that he'll have success with Muschamp and in Muschamp's system. Last but not least, we have Bo Masco, addition from Rutgers, 77.2 PFF grade, 4 passes defended, an interception, one of the best corners in the Big Ten, and he was on a defense that was outside the top 130 in multiple statistical categories. Rutgers had a bad defense. They were horrifically coached. There was no development, no coaching, no scheming whatsoever at a respectable Power 4 level in Piscataway. Now again, he is coming to a better situation. He adds good instincts. Several other top-end schools wanted him. Well, Texas got him, and he will be paired with Grayson Littleton and Kobe Black and several other talented corners to hopefully make up for an improved secondary after last year's Texas secondary got exposed for being a bit thin at certain positions. This is an A-plus portal class and has an argument to be the top portal class in the 2026 cycle. Oklahoma is up next. The Oklahoma Sooners quietly had a really good portal class, too. It wasn't a top-end portal class, but Oklahoma needed to update certain positions, and they did. Oklahoma needed to fix its offense after it was basically the SEC's Iowa of 2025. John Mateer, much like Mark Gronowski, mobile, gutsy, could make some good throws, but outside of that, you didn't have much. I would say that the main difference between those two is that Oklahoma at times could put together a lethal passing attack, especially with Satania and Burks and Kanak. And Iowa could at times put together a lethal rushing attack together with Trevor Locke, Jennings Dunker, Logan Jones, and also, Gronowski and their running backs. They could put that together. But really, they had offenses that at times could be effective and that were well coached, but just very limited in terms of talent, paired with great defenses. Oklahoma, what I love about their portal class, when you look at it, is they brought in 2 great receivers, Trell Harris and Parker Livingston, and they return Isaiah Satania. That should be one of the best receiver groups in the SEC. It could be the best in the SEC, depending on how Texas and Oklahoma develop their respective positions. Dakota Fields transfers in from Oregon at corner. I think he'll do a pretty good job and probably be an upgrade over some of the outgoing Oklahoma defensive backs. Amarian Harris is a depth offensive lineman. Cole Sullivan will be a starting linebacker for Oklahoma. Played well with Michigan at the start and middle of the year. Towards the end, had some rough patches and needs good development and good coaching, and he will get that at Oklahoma. And they also added Lloyd Avant in the running back room, even though they do return. They return Troy Blaylock, and they return, I believe, it's Xavier Robinson. But they wanted more depth there, and Jaden Ott just did not pan out with Oklahoma's offense. I don't know what happened, but something with Jaden Ott and that Oklahoma staff and offense missed, or maybe he re-aggravated an injury. Regardless, this is one of the best portal classes in America, though. I give it an A grade. And I give it an A grade because the offense is what needed to be fixed. I think they upgraded or fixed wide receiver. And then at quarterback, you bring back Mateer. Hopefully he'll be healthier and, take a leap forward in his game. They maintained at running back. And at the offensive line, they had Michael Fasusi, who was one of their best offensive linemen, a true freshman. He comes back, and I think that they, after really hitting the bottom of the barrel in 2024, are going to have a better offensive line this year than they did last year. And I trust Venables to reload on defense. Livingston is their best portal addition, in my opinion, and we'll focus on him for a few seconds or a few minutes here. Texas wanted to keep him Fact. But Texas did not want to give him the raise, or refused to give him the raise that he wanted, as, he was a freshman, redshirt freshman, and he played well. He's a future NFL receiver, but he is not Cam Coleman, nor does he have the potential Ryan Wingo does. And Texas is recruited pretty well at the position, so they probably made they made an economic choice. They made a business decision. And Livingston enters the portal, and he ends up at rival Oklahoma, who needs him a lot more than Texas does. He had 516 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, averaged 17.3 yards per reception. I have a Texas friend of mine who hated to see Livingston go. Understood why he left, why Texas didn't want to give him a raise, but hated to see him go. He is a great player. I think along with Satania, that'll be one of the more lethal wide receiver duos in America. And you add on Trell Harris, and this is it is a top, it's one of the top receiver groups in the country. They have a lethal 3-headed monster there. That with a returning quarterback, Ben Arbuckle being in year 2, and a trust in Venables to reload on defenses. He's now had 2 great defenses in a row, and the 2023 defense was respectable. It was serviceable. They figured out that side of the ball, and I think that they, could, maintain or reload on that side of the ball and be a true top 10 team this year, not just a top 20 or top 15 team that won close games with a tough schedule and really got to the playoffs, did not have the horses to win a playoff game or more than a playoff game. This season, I think Oklahoma certainly has the horses not just to win a few playoff games, but also possibly reach Atlanta and win in Atlanta. Looking at USC in the transfer portal, USC's portal class does not indicate Lincoln Riley being under pressure. USC's portal class tells me that the Trojans are still experimenting with new things. They're still trying to rebuild USC and reach the standard that they had under Pete Carroll, and before that, of winning national titles, of winning the conference you reside in. They're not there yet, though, and this portal class tells me that. It's why I give it a B portal class. I'm not giving it a D or an F because they brought in a lot through high school, and they didn't lose a lot of players to the portal that they wanted to lose. This is just a portal class that really is putting sprinkles on top of the cake being that 2026 recruiting class that was the number 1 class, that is the number 1 class in America. They oversigned, putting that in quotes because they wanted to do that. That was intentional. And they're keeping all those players, at least for this cycle, and we'll see how all of them pan out. They signed a really big class because in the past they haven't developed well, and they didn't recruit the caliber of athlete they wanted. So they're kind of hitting the reset button. When you sign a class that large, that means you're pushing out players at the top, usually. Or you're letting things age out and you're continuing to reset. And that's what USC is doing here. That's why they didn't make many key portal additions. I mean, Terrell Anderson, Jontez Williams, Devin Bryant, Zariah Fisher, Alex Van Sumeren, all of these players are experienced. They all have production. Jontez Williams and Terrell Anderson have excellent production. Devin Bryant, Van Sumeren, and Fisher are just, I would say, okay there, and are just adding depth to make sure that injuries don't cripple this team. They kind of just broke even in the portal, and the real secret sauce to this team having success in the future under Lincoln Riley, if they do, is really making sure that high school class pans out, and that, Caden Dixon Wyatt and, Kenye Pepe, their offensive tackle recruit, that they shortly and quickly are some of the best players in college football. Jontez Williams will start for them at corner. Terrell Anderson will start at wide receiver, and he will start along with Tanu Kynes. I can't believe I nearly forgot his name. That will be a great receiver group, along with, true freshman Caden Dixon Wyatt. And that's really all they have there. You look at this roster and it is very young. It's going to be a very young team this coming season, even factoring in the transfers. And that's intentional. They're trying to reset. They're still trying to rebuild. And I previously thought this was a college football playoff or bust team. But looking at how they've recruited and their portal additions and trying to interpret that, my new opinion is that USC and Riley don't really expect this year to be a breakout year. They're looking for what they had last year. Another 9-win season, maybe have some margin of error, and 8 wins maybe could be acceptable, though probably not. And 10 wins would be ecstatic. 9 or 10 wins would certainly be a successful season, especially when you look at the schedule that USC has. It's a much tougher schedule than last year, and it's even tougher than the 2024 schedule, as I would say. Certainly it's tougher than that one. So Jontez Williams, pairing him with USC cornerback Marcellus Williams, and then with Jakeem Stewart, Jada Basari, Jamal Jarrett, just adding Van Summer into that group gives a veteran presence. Zariah Fisher with Cameron Crawford and Braylon Shelby adds a third defensive end who can play at a high level in the Big Ten, and then adding Terrell Anderson with Tanu Kine, Zacharias Williams, and hoping Caden Dixon Wyatt can play as a true freshman. That at least gives you something at receiver and not just one guy and then a bunch of unproven players. This is a class that really is just sprinkles or maybe some icing on the entire cake. That is an elite recruiting class that USC just signed in 2026. It's a B caliber transfer portal class. Not an A, but it's not a C either. They didn't lose a lot of players that they wanted to keep, and they did a good job filling in some positions of need. Now looking at Michigan's transfer portal class. Michigan receives a B+ from me in this 2026 transfer portal cycle. It's a good class. The reason it wasn't an A or an A-, certainly not an A+, was because they just lost a lot of talent. Not to the NFL. I honestly think Michigan did a very poor job scouting and recruiting under Sharon Moore. And by recruiting, I don't mean in terms of talent. I mean in terms of fits. And also, they did a horrific job at developing. It's just everything was bad. With Michigan, you can only go up from a staff and development and scouting standpoint. But when you lose Justice Haynes to Georgia Tech, or you lose Cole Sullivan to Oklahoma, you lose Jaden Sanders to Notre Dame, you do lose Ty Haywood and Caden Strayhorn. You bring back Sprague, you bring back Guanera, but those aren't nothing burgers. They aren't. Cole Sullivan would have started for Michigan this coming season. I think that Justice Haynes would have started at running back for Michigan. Jaden Sanders would have probably still had some, consistent playing time there. They did lose some talent, and they also didn't cast a wide net in the portal either, and they did fail to get some key players they wanted. Like at linebacker, they wanted I think Kale Uvalde, who ended up transferring to BYU, and Michigan, missed on him. They couldn't get him to join them. But J.J. Buchanan, Jonah Leahy, Chris Bracey, Jamie French Jr., don't know why I keep saying Jaime, whatever, and then Celeste Moa, those are critical additions. French barely played at Texas, but he's a possession receiver, just was buried too deep on the depth chart and wanted some playing time. He'll get playing time at Michigan. Moa is a true freshman, 5-star commit to Utah, shows this staff can recruit if you can get a 5-star to go to Utah, and they also got Obot to go to Utah too, 5-star offensive tackle. Utah would have signed 2 5-stars this year, and technically they did. Moa just transferred to Michigan after briefly enrolling at Utah. Bracey is a proven safety from Memphis. I'm curious to see how he pans out at a higher level in the Big Ten. And J.J. Buchanan, technically you could consider him a tight end, but he's more of a, bigger slot receiver. True freshman, did well. Him along with French and Marsh are going to make up Michigan's most talented receiver room that we've seen in quite some time. but these aren't the biggest additions that Michigan has had. Smith Snowden is one of the top corners in America. 9 passes defended, 2 interceptions, a 69.3 PFF grade. Plenty of teams wanted him. I know Oregon, I believe, wanted him, and some other schools too. He follows his staff to Michigan, joins incoming defensive coordinator Jay Hill, follows Kyle Whittingham, Jason Beck, Jim Harding, a plethora of other Utah staffers, and some Utah players even, to Michigan. He's going to be starting along with Yair Hill, and I think Michigan immediately went from having a pretty mediocre cornerback room last year to now, if Hill develops better under this staff, to having one of the top cornerback rooms in not just the Big Ten, but potentially America. Corner was a huge weakness for Michigan. DB was a huge weakness for Michigan. Really, the defense as a whole was. At the end of the year, it wasn't even a top 30 unit per ESPN's efficiency. That's because the schedule was weak, and they still had pretty porous performances against, Ohio State, against Texas, against USC, against Oklahoma. I mean, I would argue even Purdue, and even, with hindsight, Maryland, they had some pretty inconsistent performances. So was not a good defense, just not a good situation for Michigan at all. They have, I think, upgraded their roster. They've upgraded their staff for sure, and they're going to be in a much better position this coming year, even with the tougher schedule, than they were last year. John Henry Daly, if he recovers from his Achilles injury properly, could be the top defensive end. Well, I'm not going to go that far because Mateo Uyunglele and Tatum Tuioti exist. Same with Indiana's guys. But Henry Daly can compete with them for that top position if he recovers from his injury. 11.5 sacks, 51 pressures, 92 PFF grade. I love the addition. You lose Derek Moore. You bring back Nate Marshall, Dominic Nichols. That's another thing about Michigan's portal class. Another reason I ranked it a B+. I could have considered it higher than that, but I decided to settle on B+. The reason it wasn't a B or a B- even if they lost is they, retained Marsh and Underwood and the offensive linemen, and they were able to bring back Yair Hill. Like, all of these players could have left, and understandably so. But they brought most of them back, and while they did lose guys who weren't nothing and who will start to have success at other programs, they kept a lot of talented players and talented younger guys home from a young team that was building to 2026 and 2027 anyway. So I like what Michigan did at the portal. I like what they did in terms of roster retention. Is this one of the best portal classes? No, I would not say so. They didn't make enough key additions, and they did lose enough players to where it's just a good portal class. But good with this staff and with the roster that comes back could translate to very big things for Michigan in 2026. As for some other classes, I am going to take a quick break here, but we only have a few more portal classes to go, along with talking about Trinidad Chambliss. So just hold on really tight, guys. I'm going to get a quick drink of water, 5-minute break, and we'll be right back. All right. Got my water break, and I was also starving, so I actually grabbed a little bit of a snack there and opened a package in the mail. I got my Chalice of Supremacy, guys. Yeah, huge shout out to Kurt Signetti for fulfilling my prediction and then going a massive step forward. We now have this is beautiful. This is like, I love how, the lettering is carved in the glass. This is fine craftsmanship. I love Pate. I don't agree with him on everything, and sometimes I get tired of his takes, as I imagine a lot of people get tired of mine at times. But he knows his stuff, and he knows what high quality is. He knows how to run an effective operation. I actually don't really support a commissioner for college football, just because I think that the sport is large enough and diverse enough to where, I mean, maybe there should be a commissioner, though, because maybe it needs that central authority figure. He'd be good at that. But I think he'd be good to have on just a committee, too. That might be more realistic because I don't think a lot of I don't think top NCAA people would like him because they're shills, and he's not. But this is beautiful. Shout out to Josh Pate. I imagine everyone watching this or who will watch it know who he is. He's the biggest name in college football. But if you haven't already, check out his stuff. I'll check on it here and there. I don't have a lot of time to watch other creators, but him, Cover 3, Chris Drew, Juck on Bucks, Michigan Podcast, Steve Dace, Trojan Blade, Corn Craze. There's a lot of creators who I will, I'll peek in. I'll peek in and see what they're doing here and there. So, yeah. Shout out to them. But let's get back to this. Let's finish this out. Talk about Tennessee's 2026 transfer portal class. Tennessee had a successful transfer portal cycle in 2026. I give their class a B+ grade because they were able to retool the defense and bring in some key pieces that will help Jim Knowles transition into a successful defense in year one. Now, will it be an elite defense? No, I wouldn't say so. Tim Banks messed that roster up and that defense up pretty badly. It was outside the top 90 in multiple categories last year, and Knowles has a history of needing a transition year to get things going from just good or serviceable to great or elite, which is what Tennessee wants. But they brought in some key players, a lot of Penn State guys. So Amari Campbell, Xavier Gilliam, DeJuan Lane. We'll talk about Chaz Coleman in a few seconds. They all played in his system for a year. They all had success in it. I mean, Campbell was their best linebacker when Roas was out. Gilliam was a serviceable D tackle. Lane was an okay safety. Coleman was fantastic as a pass rusher, though probably needs to get bigger and more experience to help him stop the run. But it helps to have some future starters that will be in key positions that have played in your system before. And that will kind of give the defense overall, especially in a complicated system like Knowles, a leg up. So when you have talented, experienced, smart players who've played in the system, that helps a great system and a complicated one at that, because the great systems in a lot of cases can be complicated to make it harder for quarterbacks to diagnose them, to establish their checks or check downs or their different, their different reads. I like where this defense is going to be from a year one Jim Knowles perspective. So what I mean by that is, will it be great? I don't know. I don't think it'll be a top 10 defense, but will it be one that probably flirts with the top 30, top 25? Maybe can be better than that. If not, it's going to be way better than it was last year. I'm confident that's going to happen. You're going to see Tennessee's defense at minimum undertake a transformation that USC's defense did under D'Anton Lynn in year one, where immediately it was way better than where Grinch had it. That's what Tennessee's defense is going to experience. And on top of that, they bring in Kayin Lee, good corner from Auburn. He'll be in a better system. Pairing him with Lane and with other players in that secondary gives me confidence, along with adding Campbell at linebacker and then adding Chaz Coleman to a defensive line that over the past 2 years has lost a lot of production and has had good players there. Chaz Coleman, with an 81.1 PFF grade, a sack, a forced fumble, did a great job getting pressures throughout the season. He's 6'4", 246 pounds. He's from Ohio. It sounded like he wanted to go to Ohio State, or that Ohio State wanted him. Penn State also wanted to keep him. Tennessee ultimately, I think, had the best NIL deal, and you had, you were working with the same defensive coordinator you did last year. And, well, he decided to follow his DC, Jim Knowles, to Tennessee, and I think he'll have success there. He didn't have a ton of production, but he was also a true freshman. And I kind of think that he either got soft benched or opted out towards the end of the year when it became clear, hey, we're going to undergo a staff change and there's going to be a new regime and I might want to partake in, a successful season, not undergo a rebuild, which Penn State, they might have success this coming season. They may also enter a pretty severe rebuild. Tennessee is right now a more established, more consistent program because of their staff continuity and history for a few years now, about a half decade now, with Josh Heupel at the helm. I give it a B+ grade overall, and I, give it that B+ grade because they didn't make a lot of game-changing additions, but they made additions that will help raise the floor of the defense. Coleman in the long haul could be a game-changing addition, and they retained a lot of key players like David Sanders at tackle and some of their receivers on the offensive side of the football. Speaking of Penn State, we just talked about Chaz Coleman and a lot of outgoing Penn State transfers. Let's talk about Penn State's portal class and some of their incoming transfers. Matt Campbell did the best job he reasonably could to keep Penn State's roster together, to keep the recruiting class together, to keep the good aspects of the James Franklin culture and era together, and bring in his own players. I will be honest here, just out of the gate, because I don't want to do the, everyone, believe me, trust me, everyone had a successful portal class. We're not, coked out radio. We're not striptease radio. We're not what Paul Feinbaum is to the SEC to every college football team. We're not always going to be positive here. I like the portal class. I do not like the roster composition, though. And what I mean by that is they had to bring in this type of portal class with a large amount of players. Many of them are just okay. Some are great. Some are even maybe borderline elite because of how much they lost. Penn State loses a ton to the NFL. They lost a ton to the transfer portal. And the reason it's a C+ is when you factor in what they lose along with what they bring in, they do have a talent drop-off there. And in order to compensate for that, Penn State is going to have superior coaching and development. I do believe they will have those things, but it's the same, thing, kind of a much exaggerated version of what we're seeing with, Georgia and Ohio State. And I think it's actually very similar to what we're seeing with Alabama. Alabama and Penn State, their rosters are eroding very quickly. A lot of them, especially Penn State way more so than Alabama, but Alabama lost a lot this cycle. Penn State basically changed their entire roster in this cycle with rare exceptions. They are going to have superior coaching this year and in following seasons compared to last year if they do not want their team to kind of fall off the face of the earth and go from what Penn State and Alabama had last year and in prior years were top 10 teams. Saban had top 5 teams that won it all. And now you're looking at them, and I'm thinking myself, you can look at my preseason top 25, I'm thinking these aren't even top 15 rosters. They're not. They might not even be top 25 teams in power ratings when it's all said and done. That's how many questions there are here. I'm not going to go that extreme with either team, but with Penn State, Rocco Becht is a better quarterback than Drew Aller, but how much of that is he played easier competition, had a better coach, had a better system, so on and so forth, because Aller is a much more talented NFL quarterback. And if he were properly developed and trained in college, he would have been a much better quarterback than Rocco Becht. Carson Hansen is not Katron Allen or Nicholas Singleton. Jeremiah Cooper at safety is good. Is he Zakee Wheatley? I have no idea. Marcus Neal Jr. is he Zakee Wheatley? Jeremiah Cooper got injured a bit last year. I'm curious to see how he recovers. But is he A.J. Harris of 2024? Penn State's had a lot of good corners, pass them by on their way to the NFL. So I'm interested to see how this rebuild goes of mostly Iowa State players, but you also have some key players coming in, like they brought in a good center from Texas State. Keanu Williams is a serviceable Big Ten defensive tackle, 6'5", 320 pounds. He'll be, I think, in his fifth year. Interested to see how, as Penn State probably gets larger on the offensive and defensive line than they were under Franklin, due to Campbell at Iowa State historically having larger size in the O-line, and all the transfers they're bringing in at D-tackle who are like 310, 320 pounds. I'm curious to see if that alleviates some of the athletic and NFL talent drop-off, or if it doesn't. There's a lot of change going on at Penn State. One thing that will remain similar is the tight end position being loaded, as was customary under Franklin. 65.7 PFF grade is what Benjamin Brahmer had at Iowa State, with 446 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. Iowa State with Benjamin Brahmer and Gabe Burkle had one of the more diverse and lethal tight end groups in America. And I expect that again. This time at Penn State, though. They're bringing both of them over. Rapeliak comes back. So you have some of that, leftover recruiting sauce to work with, along with the proven production. This is going to be a strength of the Penn State and Taylor Mauser offense. Chase Sowell, speaking of receiver, he would have been Penn State's, I think, best receiver last year and best receiver the year prior, although maybe Wallace was better. I don't know. Wallace going to Ole Miss and looking good, and then Keandre Lambert-Smith having success at Auburn with Peyton Thorne. There was something amiss there. And I wonder if we're going to see in a documentary 5-10 years down the road, if information will slowly leak out, how the James Franklin era ended and how that man was so ridiculously... think about it this way. Sharon Moore had he had the same amount of regular season top 5 victories that James Franklin did. Now, both were flukes. Michigan getting Ohio State with their head up their rear in 2024 at home, and the blocked kick for Penn State in 16. But how a guy who should have never been a head coach and was, thinking with his third middle finger, if you get the gist, how that guy was able to have the same amount of top 5 victories in his career in 2 years that James Franklin did in over a decade at Penn State. There was just something wrong. I don't know what it is. It's probably a Franklin thing. Maybe it was a Penn State thing. Maybe it was a bit of both. I don't know what it was. But, I mean, my goodness. Anyway, did not mean to get off track, but the point being that, in theory, as I mentioned earlier, the reason I gave it a C+ is there is a pretty severe talent drop-off. The blue chip ratio of this roster is going to plummet. It will probably not be a 50% BCR roster this coming year, and it was above 60%, hovering close to 70% this past season. It's going to implode. The NFL talent profile of this roster is going to be its lowest in eons. And yet, the team might be better for it. And that's why I said there's something off there. Like Chase Sowell, on paper, solely looking at recruiting rankings, should never be even close to the most talented Penn State receiver. But he's coming here, and he has production and film that says, actually, yeah, he's probably Penn State's best receiver since 2022 when they had like Parker Washington, for example. Another key addition, last one I want to talk about here, is Caleb Bacon. Caleb Bacon is a very old, wise, physical player. 3 sacks last year, PFF grade in the 70s. I remember announcers talking about him in like 2022 and 2023, I believe. I remember that. I mean, he's a veteran. He's been with Campbell through, thick and thin, through hellfire and brimstone, and through, hoisting the Pop-Tarts Bowl trophy when they won 11 games and, Iowa State set a, single season record for wins in a season. He's been through it all. So having him as a leader on the defense and pairing him with Tony Rojas, who decided to come back, that gives Penn State, as much as they lost, quite possibly one of the best linebacker groups and possibly the best starting linebacker duo in the entire Big Ten. Maybe I'm too harsh on Penn State's portal class. When I give it a C+, I want to emphasize this is not me saying this is Campbell's fault. A lot of Penn State's departures have a lot to do with how they constructed their roster under Franklin, where they were going to undergo a rebuild in 2026 anyway with how senior-laden that roster was. And when Franklin got fired, I imagine he encouraged a lot of those players to enter the portal. And with how Franklin built the culture was all centered around him. That's why the team took on all his attributes, his flaws, the good things about him. It's why after that Oregon game, when you could tell in the press conference that it felt like Franklin was broken, that the team was then broken, Penn State needed a reset. The problem with a reset is you can't ignore the reality that sometimes that results in a talent drop-off and can make the job of the next guy that much harder. So that's why I give it a C+. But let's continue to move on, march through, talk about Auburn. Auburn. What do I think about Auburn here? Auburn is also undergoing a roster transfer. Auburn is changing its philosophy, its methods, its staff, and they're also changing its roster. For how much talent at a variety of positions they lose to the NFL or they lose to the portal, I believe Golesh has done a very good job. I give the class a B- grade because I have to factor in what's going out versus what's coming in. But Auburn's going to be the better for this, and you're going to see better portal classes and better recruiting classes from them in the long haul. They are resetting the culture. They're resetting the expectation. They're bringing in a lot of proven production. So with Hugh Freeze, Auburn was always recruiting at a high level until this past year. Always, always, always. But so few of those players ever panned out. Did Cam Coleman get better at his time with Auburn? Not really. And even if he did, they had no one to throw to him the entire time. Look at Jackson Arnold. Jackson Arnold was the same pumpkin at Auburn that he was at Oklahoma as a glorified service academy quarterback. Now, Byron Brown's mobile, and Byron Brown is, not the best quarterback in the world, but he's a huge upgrade over Jackson Arnold, in my opinion, especially now that you're going to have familiarity with the system. He started with USF for, I think, 2 or 3 seasons now. Deshaun Womack, Bryson Washington, Keshawn Singleton, Chaz Nimrod are some other players that Auburn is bringing in. Much of the USF offense from last year is transferring in, along with some players on the defensive side of the football as well. A lot of these players are older. They've been with the system and the coaching staff for a long time. Auburn retained DJ Durkin, so I trust a lot of the additions on the defensive side of the ball to pan out immediately at an SEC level. Don't know if that'll be the case with the offense because of the caliber of play, but that, Josh Heupel, Alex Golesh, Tennessee-style offense has a knack for, a lot of people criticize it for not being an offense that prepares you for the NFL. I don't know how true that is, but I do know that the advantage of some of those systems that are, teach you way more about getting open, or that just get you open on your own and, are kind of gamey. They game things, they take advantage of things, they take advantage of loopholes, is you can also win a whole lot with that style of offense, regardless of the player you have. Not saying it's a direct comparison to Indiana's offense. Those are very, very, very different offenses. But if you execute at a high level and you know the system, and it's a system that has schematic advantages over most defenses you will face, Indiana's, for example, with the RPO, freezes linebackers and defensive linemen, helps protect the quarterback, helps confuse the defensive front. So if they're not disciplined, they can take advantage of them by, having an advantage in that, the offensive line's run blocking because it's an RPO. The defensive line doesn't know whether they're going to try to stop the run or stop the pass. Same with the linebackers. The receivers know that they're running their route. So you get the point. I think you could see something here where maybe the offensive additions don't pan out at all because they're not as talented or as good as many of the SEC players on defense are, but maybe the system's also just that good. I mean, we've seen this with Heupel. Regardless of the level of quarterback they have, they put up good numbers. They make big plays. It only in a lot of their big games, and this has changed recently, when they face elite defenses that are better schemed, coached, and have more talent, do you then shut them down? And that's a very rare instance, and will continue to be a very rare instance. So I've said it publicly before. I think this is all that LSU and Lane Kiffin nailed their portal class. I have my questions and concerns about just the overall fit of Lane Kiffin and who he is and the style of football he likes, and overlaying that on top of LSU's expectations, which is win a title and compete for a title every year. But they are off to a really good start and a very strong start entering 2026 because they lost a ton to the NFL and to the portal, but they also brought in a ton. And unlike, say, Penn State or Auburn or Iowa State or these other teams that underwent huge program resets and had to bring in, 30, 40 players, LSU basically did that, except the vast majority of them were all quality talent. I mean, we're going to talk about a few other guys besides players listed here, but, Eugene Wilson, Jace Brown, Ty Benefield, TJ Daughtery, Princewell Unman-Malin. I mean, these are all quality guys at worst, and some of them are potential alien players at best. And these aren't even the main additions here. I mean, Unman-Malin's a good player. Daughtery, I'd say, is an above-average player. Benefield's good. Wilson has a lot of upside to him. Jace Brown is a very proven Big 12 wide receiver. It's not even mentioning Trey Brown from Old Dominion. That's not even mentioning Jordan Seaton. It's not mentioning Sam Levitt. And they return, they return Spears. They return DJ Pickett. They return Whit Weeks. I mean, they bring back some NFL guys on defense as well. So this is looking to be one of the best rosters in college football this fall. And that is encouraging because, well, in the long term, Kiffin's going to be expected to win national titles at LSU. In the short term, the expectation this year is probably just make the playoff. Just make it. Make the playoff or compete with it and field an offense and be competitive in your big games, where Kelly, in large part, really wasn't outside of his first year there, where, he beat a somewhat poorly coached Alabama team. That they weren't really, live in these big games when it was all said and done. You look with hindsight. So I think this is a top 15 team at the worst. It is a top 10 team at best, and a top 10 team in this new era can compete for a national title. So if I'm an LSU fan, I'm ecstatic. I mean, I'm pumping my fists and I'm jumping up and down at the fact that, hey, we took a lot of Ole Miss's better players. We took Kansas State's best receiver. We took a safety that I think Michigan and their staff wanted because they got Boise State's safety coach. And we took, an offensive tackle that Texas and Miami and Oregon wanted in Jordan Seaton. We got a quarterback in Sam Leavitt that, Tennessee and Oregon and some of these other schools, Texas Tech, were entertaining. So they did such a good job. And if Leavitt's healthy, these numbers for 2025 are not going to translate to this season if he's healthy. He did not have a great supporting cast. He's going to have a much better supporting cast at LSU than he ever did at ASU, and he wasn't healthy. He's constantly dealing with injuries. At some point, he had a season-ending injury. What Arizona State did, winning with Jeff Sims, by the way, was very impressive, because Sims is a horrible quarterback, and if you ever want to watch some very cancerous football, just watch Jeff Sims play. Leavitt is a guy with future NFL potential, and I know that because of how he played against Texas with Arizona State, where he was under pressure almost every snap. He evaded pressure most of those times, made plays with his legs, even made some good throws, fit into some tight windows. He just needs proper training and a better supporting cast, and he'll get both with Lane Kiffin and this LSU roster. Trey Brown III brought him up earlier from Old Dominion. 726 pass receiving yards, 20.1 yards per reception, 38 receptions at a 71.3 PFF grade. On top of Jace Brown, on top of Eugene Wilson III, I mean, that is just an uber talented wide receiver core. That is such a talented group. This team is going to remind me so much of the Ole Miss team of last year. Probably a hybrid between last year's Ole Miss team and the 2024 Ole Miss team, because the offensive line looks like. I'm curious there, because one thing Kiffin at Ole Miss was not well known for, even though he is an offensive savant, was the offensive line. Where this past year, Kawan Lacey had success in large part due to yards after contact, constantly breaking tackles, and just being an amazing player. Ole Miss's line isn't really that good. It was the same thing in 2024. Sometimes the reason that offense sputtered out of control is the offensive line was not good enough to impose their will on better defenses that they played. And that would result in some of their losses. Like the loss to Kentucky, they struggled to run the ball. The loss against Florida, there was some questionable play calling, but they also struggled to run the ball. And it's been a consistent theme there. I mean, they've had wonderful running backs, wonderful receivers, wonderful tight ends, wonderful quarterbacks. O-line has been the question. So I'm curious to see, with a potential alien in Jordan Seaton, how LSU builds that offensive line, if Seaton takes steps forward, if LSU's O-line takes steps forward. That is an area that I want to research, actually, this weekend, is looking at LSU's O-line now that I'm talking about it. But this class is fantastic. They did well on defense. They did well in retaining the players that they could, who they wanted, and they just brought in stud after stud after stud. So it is an A-plus portal class in my book. Now we can talk about two more Big Ten teams, then we'll talk about Trinidad Chambliss really quickly, and then we'll get out of here. This has been a fun show. It's been a little bit over 2 hours. Kind of more like my type of show, honestly. I like the 2 hours. I like going live for more than an hour. Don't like going live for really more than 3. This is kind of the sweet spot here. Let's talk about Nebraska, though. Nebraska's in a bit of a pickle with Matt Rule and their roster. But one thing that I'm going to give that program and staff credit for is their portal class. They lost Raiola to Oregon and Emmett Johnson to the NFL, Keona Davis to Miami, and they nearly lost some more players as well. But they're able to retain some of them, and they brought in a handful of transfers that I think are competent to good, maybe even great players. And that's important because when you lose Dylan Raiola, and trust me, the loss of him really docked my grade for Nebraska. If Nebraska, say, kept Raiola and then made the portal moves they did outside of that, I probably would have given them a B+ or even A- grade. I mean, losing Raiola really sets Nebraska back, I would say, a year or maybe even 2 years. It truly hampers their ceiling and what they can and maybe even will do to a certain degree. That changed a lot. And then also losing Emmett Johnson on top of that to the draft when he was eligible to return. And I think oftentimes most good running backs will return and exhaust their eligibility because they're not going to be valued as much in the NFL as in college, means Nebraska, I think, is lacking in some funds. But as questionable as I think Nebraska's staff is entering this year, it's a huge year for Rule and that staff. And as much as I think the roster needs some tweaks, this portal class is going to help them. What do I mean by that? Well, Anthony Jones and Quasi Gilmer, that is a good duo from UCLA. Anthony Jones is a competent defensive end who has appropriate size. Now, size isn't everything, but Nebraska, when they rolled out on defense last year, it looked like they were running a 1-5-5 or a 6-5. And by 6-5, I mean 6 linebackers and 5 defensive backs. They did not have true defensive line size at almost any position last year. They were so small that you could see it without even looking closely at the screen. Like, you just notice it immediately. Like, oh my gosh, they're tiny. Their ends are basically out, so they're not even edge players, or not even, certainly not D ends, but they're not even edge players. They're like smaller outside linebackers. Their D tackles are built like smaller defensive ends. They needed size, and getting Anthony Jones, who's 265, 6'5", older player from UCLA, it's good to have some size in that group on top of, returning Williams, Nwaneri. And with that new staff and another year under strength and conditioning, they'll probably naturally get larger there as they get older. Quasi Gilmer will help Nebraska's receiver room maintain a status of, I would say, competency. At times it could be lethal. Other times they suffer from drops, poor coaching moments. But Naziah Hunter comes back, Ja'Cory Barney Jr. comes back, Quasi Gilmer transfers in. That is a great crop of receivers, and they were young there to begin with last year, so the entire room, even while they lose Dane Key, will probably improve. Owen Chambliss is a player I love. He's old, had a lot of proven production at San Diego State, 85.5 PFF grade, and he follows Rob Orich, his defensive coordinator at San Diego State, to Nebraska, where he is going to be Nebraska's new defensive coordinator in a new 4-2-5 defense. Some other additions to pay attention to. You got Brendan Black from Iowa State. He was a 4-star per 24/7 Sports, 3-star in the portal per On3, which is the rankings we use. I like their rankings more than 24/7 Sports because they measure who is leaving and who's coming in, not just who's coming in, which is very important, as you can imagine. Brendan Black, I think, will replace Rocco Spindler as being a veteran, good transfer portal offensive lineman. And with new O-line coach Jeep Wade replacing Donovan Raiola, I imagine that unit will take a step forward. Calandria, I know his PFF grade is high, and I agree with PFF a lot, but there are times where I disagree with it because there are some things about PFF that are wrong and are amiss. It's a useful tool because they're really the only guys grading every college player, and a lot of the grades align, but grades don't directly translate because you have different staffs, you have different supporting casts, you're facing different competition. Calandria is a option quarterback. He has a better arm than, say, Alex Orji, who initially, I think, actually started over him in the first game of the UNLV Rebels 2025 season. He has a better arm than Orji, and he's a great runner, but he does not have the arm talent, not even close to the arm talent Raiola does. He does not have the accuracy, the arm strength. Probably will do a better job at evading sacks because he's more mobile, but I don't know if he has the same pocket awareness either. I'd have to watch more about that. You are getting a lower floor, lower ceiling quarterback in exchange for probably helping your rushing attack open up because again, much like Kawan Lacey at Ole Miss last year, or like Bo Jackson at Ohio State, the only reason Nebraska ever had a good rushing offense was because their running back was good. It had nothing to do with the offensive line up front. So with the loss of EJ and the loss of Raiola and replacing them with guys who are just not the caliber of athlete they are, you need to make sure the other positions rise up. The reason why I give Nebraska's class a B grade is I think they did a good job at that. I think offensive line will improve, wide receiver will improve, and I think the defense as a whole is also going to get better. So it's a good transfer portal class. Nebraska's just going to have to make sure that other things outside of a good portal class hit so that with a tough schedule, they can continue to gain momentum or regain momentum under Matt Rule. And last transfer portal class to talk about, let's discuss Michigan State. Michigan State is entering a new era under first-year head coach Pat Fitzgerald, a hire that I liked, Michigan State is entering a new era under first-year head coach Pat Fitzgerald. It's a hire that I like. It is a hire that has the potential to make me love it. That's an awkward way of phrasing it. And it's a hire that better fits Michigan State's culture and what they want to do than what Jonathan Smith offered up to the plate. But there are limitations to Michigan State right now because they have been a bad football program and team for years. They've had fired head coach after fired head coach. Really, ever since 2014, 2015, they have not had back-to-back good seasons. And by good, I simply mean, winning, 8 games or more, including the bowl game, 2 years in a row. They have not had that in over a decade. They have not. And that combined with probably some donor skepticism, not having the same pockets as some of the top schools, and just being in this obscure place and making a weird hire. It's a hire I like, but the Pat Fitzgerald hire is weird. He's been out of the coaching world in college football for a few years. The hazing scandal is what did him in, even though he had to Northwestern had to settle with him because they didn't find him they didn't find him responsible of any wrongdoing he didn't know. But he also didn't finish well at Northwestern either. They went 3-9 2019, and then I think 8-2 or 7-2 in the COVID year. And then they went 3-9 2021 and 1-11 in 2022 and didn't profile as that good of a team in 2023 before he got fired. And then David Braun came along, and David Braun's had success there. 2 seasons with a winning record, 2 seasons with bowl victories. It's been a pretty incredible story there. So keeping all of that in mind and who's leaving, who's coming in, I gave this portal class a C+ grade. I wanted to give it a higher grade, but Michigan State just brought in a lot of bodies, a lot of players who I think are anywhere from below average to above average, and some players from a lower level who could pan out well, who could be good or great players, who could be, there's no All-Americans on this roster, but there are some All-Big Ten players. I think that Kenny Soares Jr., who played well at Northwestern before leaving for NC State, he could be a good player. Brantley's been an All-Big Ten player before. He was in 2024 before he transferred to Miami. I think he just got, he fell into the grass isn't always greener on the other side trope. And with how deep Miami's defense was, just didn't pan out there. But he comes back and could be a good player. KK Smith had some playing time at Notre Dame last year. He should be one of Michigan State's top receivers. Fraley was an FCS All-American. So if he translates and he's 6'1", 300 pounds, NC State's done a good job with offensive linemen and developing them in the past. I think that Michigan State has a good chance to maybe have an All-Big Ten caliber center. And Ben Morosky, I think, could be an All-Big Ten caliber offensive tackle, 6'6", 344 pounds. Was one of the top offensive tackles in the transfer portal. The Spartans, in totality, when you look at their transfer portal class, I guess what I would be concerned with is you lose Nick Marsh to Indiana, who would be your best receiver this year. And I know Milihojevic started over Childs, but Childs was also a bit banged up. He kept getting hit. Maybe there was a little bit of a quit thing there as the season went on. And, they lose to UCLA, they lose to Michigan, they just keep losing, and the team checks out. But Childs is more talented than Milihojevic. Like, he has a higher ceiling at quarterback. It would not shock me at all if, in part due to supporting cast and, different things, it would not shock me at all if Childs was better than Milohojevic this year, with Childs being at Northwestern and Milohojevic being the starting QB at Michigan State. It wouldn't shock me one bit. Not saying that Childs is perfect or great. He's far from that. But there's a reason he was starting over Milohojevic, and then as the season completely unraveled and you needed a change and Childs was banged up, then the move was made. Michigan State brought in 28 transfers, but 37 left. And they lost some players, for example, like I already mentioned, Nick Marsh could have an NFL future. They lose Mekhi Frazier, who was an okay running back, and look, Ole Miss offered him. There must be something there. They also lost David Santiago to Kansas, Stanton Ramil to Auburn, Alex Van Sumeren to USC, Aiden West, who was their best corner per PFF, to Minnesota, Michael Masunis to Texas. Some of these guys just needed a fresh starter. They weren't really good, but others are good players that this staff really could have utilized. And the players they bring in, it is a lot of backups or rotational caliber players and not a whole lot of starters, with rare exception. The good news about this class is that they brought in a lot of high caliber offensive linemen, like Fraley and Murawski were starters and started at a high level at their prior schools. That, I think, is good. And also they brought in Reese Dakin, the All-American punter from Iowa, along with their special teams coordinator, LeVar Woods. It is a staff that I like. It is a roster that I like. I'm remaining in the cautiously optimistic camp about Michigan State improving compared to last year. The portal class just it doesn't have enough big hitters, at least on a surface level and maybe a mild deep level, for me to grade it anything higher than a C+ when you factor in what they lose. As I continue to dig deeper into these rosters, maybe my tune will change on that, but I have also done, a fair amount of research here so far. I do think that, look, the offensive line is the best position in this portal class for Michigan State, and everything else just kind of like, okay, we'll make sure we get bodies, that we get in depth so that injuries don't really tear us apart. And last but not least, I was going to do a Big Ten schedule deep dive today, but I pushed that back. And by deep dive, I don't mean like a reaction, because it's been out for 2 weeks now. Reaction will be very late. By deep dive, I mean like telling you, like, okay, here's who has the toughest schedule, why they have the toughest schedule, easiest, why, and everything in between. It'd be like a 35, 40-minute video. We're going to do that next week. Trinidad Chambliss has been ruled eligible for 2026. What does this mean for college football? What does this mean for Ole Miss? I want to start off by discussing what this means for Ole Miss. Number one, it means that Ole Miss has finally, figured out some things about the game of college football. What do I mean by that? I mean that there aren't rules in college football. That I think is lesson number one. Trinidad Chambliss being ruled eligible for 2026 continues to prove my thesis that in college football there are few, if any, rules. The medical redshirt claim, I don't know if it was bogus or not. I happen to believe that Tony Annese, their coach, and Trinidad Chambliss, Ole Miss's quarterback, now and entering 2026 are good people. So I'm not going to say it's, bogus, but the fact it was a Mississippi judge who probably has some affiliation just by proximity there, and they overruled the NCAA's, claim and attempt to force Trinidad Chambliss to go pro, tells me that, look, there aren't rules. Like, the NCAA can't enforce anything here. They don't have power. They only have reputational power. They have the same power that a very physically weak and ill person does, because they're a master manipulator and because they know how to push certain buttons to get people to do what they want to do. That's the only power they have. If they can't manipulate you, they can't do anything. If they can't convince you to lower the gun from their head, they don't have the reaction time, the invulnerable skin, the superpower, anything to not get shot in the head and die. That's just the reality. Okay. Is it a great thing for college football? No. But is this good for Ole Miss, and can they celebrate that? Yeah. I mean, Trinidad Chambliss was their best player outside of maybe Kawan Lacey last year, and both are back. Lacey signed a new deal. Chambliss signed a new deal and pledged before he even knew he was eligible for this year that if he was, he'd be back at Ole Miss. They returned Will Eccles. Sure, they lost some other players on the defensive side and offensive side of the football to the portal. They do retain some key players, though. They have recruited at an okay level. They've retained some of their staff from last year, made new staff hires, and they brought back their two best players, Trinidad Chambliss and Kawan Lacey. That should give Ole Miss fans optimism that, hey, if Pete Golding is the guy, if he has the proper coaches in place, and he puts his players in a position to win, and they develop well, and their scouting and recruiting pans out, and they have new players that step up to the plate and replace the departing players, heck, Ole Miss could maybe be a college football playoff contender next year, even with a tougher schedule, because their players are just as good. Their coaching staff retools and reloads. They get some juice from, Kiffin leaving and Golding coming in, and you get some of that, revenge still on their mind, that extra added motivation. Who knows? It's an absolute win for Ole Miss. I actually think in the long run, this will be a win for college football too. Again, there are no rules, and that's very clear. In order for there to be rules, you need it to be obvious that there are none. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you want things to truly change, it has to get worse before it gets better. So if Chambliss wasn't given an additional year of eligibility, there would be this cloud hanging over, that this deception that would say, no, there are rules in college football. Meanwhile, Texas, Oregon, Texas Tech, whatever, are spending $40 million or north of that, maybe even north of $50 million, for example. And no coach will accept that publicly, because it's this it's this sign of shame if you're outspending everyone roster-wise. No one wants to accept that. But you have to accept truth, and you have to accept the reality of the situation before things can get better. And this will help some people do that. It is so abundantly clear. Like Nizier Forqueen, he gets denied for an extra year of eligibility at Wisconsin. But Joey Aguilar, he'll probably get granted another year. Trinidad Chambliss got granted another year. Mohamed Touré is going to be in his 8th year at Miami. He got granted another year. You see this over and over and over again across college football. In college basketball, we're dealing with, NBA players getting signed, and some get rejected. Some, we just saw the situation in Alabama where they could no longer play their, ex NBA guy, but Baylor signed a guy and he's still on their roster. I know that Green Bay, for example, in basketball, they had they had a very old player, and I think even a former NBA player they signed mid-season. That's going to come to college football too, guys. Random billionaires who seem random, but they're actually affiliated with the university, and they decide, you know what? I'm going to say screw it. I'm going to do this for fun, and we're just going to inject tons of money into this team and make them great. That's coming. The whole Mr. Beast, let's give $100 million to ECU to win it all. Something like that's going to happen at some point. And if it doesn't at a smaller school, it will happen at a bigger school, where I think you're kind of seeing this with Texas too, how they're maintaining that many NFL players and bringing that many in while recruiting the way they do. They're spending north of $500 million, guys, or around there. Oregon bringing back that many NFL players, including some possible first rounders, and recruiting at that level, and getting Raiola in the portal, getting Coy Parrish and Iverson Hooks in the portal. They're spending an ungodly amount of money. Texas Tech they have to overpay to get top guys, or at least they did, and they probably still do, because they don't have a proven NFL resume. They don't have, the best location. They don't play in the best conference, and they haven't won, a big game still, really. And there's still young staff and young program, and they just started to do this last year. They're spending an insane amount of money. USC is, with the recruiting class they just brought in. And now that Indiana won it all, you're going to see other smaller programs try to test that water, test that avenue of, we're going to try to spend, we're going to try to out-scout, we're going to do whatever it takes to win, because we saw a historically small program do that. Ole Miss has done it before in the portal. They've spent a lot of money. They out-scouted and coached, out-recruited other programs in the portal and won with it. Trinidad Chambliss being ruled eligible this year is a pretty big deal. It's going to give the SEC another college football playoff contender, potentially, depending on how the other roster, how the other parts of the roster fill out. It gives Ole Miss, I would say, the top quarterback outside of maybe Arch Manning or maybe Gunnar Stockton in the SEC. And it shows once again that, look, college football doesn't have rules. There is no CSC or NIL Go. There is no roster cap. It doesn't exist. It exists in the same way that this is a really, funny and niche story, so hold on. East Germany, the, German Democratic Republic, a communist puppet state of the Soviet Union, was gifted this island off the coast of Cuba in the 80s or 70s or something. You can look it up. I think it's even called like Ernest Thalmann Island. It's named after one of Germany's, communist politicians of the 21st or 20th century. They gave East Germany that island. Like, that island was East German territory. It was not transferred to West Germany when West Germany and East Germany merged to form Germany, like the current state of Germany. So you could argue that, like, technically, and there's conspiracy theories about this, that, technically East Germany exists on this tiny island by Cuba, and it's protected by Cuba. I mean, de facto, there could be an argument there, or de jure, got those mixed up. De jure, on paper, there could be an argument there. In practice, that is insane. That is insane to think that East Germany exists on an island that never really had any Germans on it. That would be very insane. That is what you have here. It's the same thing with, like, laws in state government that are overridden by federal laws or new state laws. Yeah, technically they exist. They don't mean anything. They don't do anything. They're not enforceable, for example. That is what we have in college football right now with these caps. They only matter to those gullible enough and easily manipulated enough to be trapped in those confines. They do not exist for the bold, for the strong, and those who want to win. And to a certain degree, that's good. You don't want to limit those go-getters. But at the same time, if we let this get too out of control, well, it will be even worse than it was in the 2010s and late 2000s, when only one conference effectively controlled everything. It will be that again, but even worse if the arms race continues, because eventually all but, the amount of schools I can count on one hand are effectively priced out of winning a title, with rare exception. So in order for us to stop that from happening, it needs to be made obvious that there are no rules. So that way, people see the opportunity to actually create a legitimate enforcement arm in college football. So thank you to that judge, that Mississippi judge in Trinidad Chambliss, for fighting for this and for adding just another bit of instability to the sport. So that way, sooner rather than later, we can fix these issues. That's it, everyone. That's it. We're done with the stream. I don't know if it'll be today. Certainly these will start to upload tomorrow. Might get to some of them today. But over the weekend, these will be uploaded. Make sure to comment, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment your thoughts down below. I am happy to be back. We'll be live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday next week with some new topics, new graphics, and a lot of just epic college football conversation. Thank you for the support, for the love, just for everything. You have made it possible to pursue my dreams of covering the sport for life. I will see you guys very soon.